Good morning, good afternoon, and good night, wherever you're tuning in. We are Slava and Jonathan, bringing you the Side Quest podcast, where we talk about character development, stories, and all things that are world building. And we occasionally take side quests, because, frankly, that's how conversations work. Just as a reminder, this whole show is spoiler heavy. So sit back, tune in, and join us on this episode of Side Quest.
You're muted.
I am the boomer. I have no riz. Stupid. I am the boomer of this episode.
Good morning, Jonathan.
Good morning, Vietnam. You know what that's from, right?
I do. I watched it when I was a kid in school when a sub was in
school?
in the class. In school. So we had a substitute teacher one day, and the teacher said, you know what, just make him watch Good Morning Vietnam and write me like have a page on how they feel about whatever. Anyway, I know where that's from. It was from the movie of
Good Morning Vietnam.
Good Morning
Early
Vietnam.
Robin Williams. They sent this funny man over to Vietnam to try to spark comedy back into the lives of the soldiers. Like, hey, we know you're at war, but we sent your comedian. Good luck.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
And then, as it always goes, he raises morale, but the morale is raised beyond the bar that the leaders want, so he gets ousted. It's kind of Dead Poet Society, only in Vietnam.
Yeah. I mean, when you put it that way, you're not wrong. You're not wrong. But, yeah, good morning, everybody. Happy to be here. Happy to enjoy Dune Part 2 with you. We're on a bit of a time crunch this morning because I was late, but we will dive in. Slava, why don't you get us started on chapters 13 to 22? Give us the old summary.
Bringing up my notes here. So,
Cool.
So in this section, we see Tufir Hawat, which is one of the lieutenants for Leto, intercept a note allegedly from Baron to Jessica. I didn't get that, but that's how what Hawat takes away from it. So Leto tells him, all right, watch Jessica. But he doesn't believe it to be Jessica at all. And he even tells Paul to tell his mother, when the time comes, I never suspected her. They go visit a spice mining operation. It's attacked by a sandworm. And it turns out that Leto has to save them because a Harkonnen spy has stolen the spacecraft that's supposed to take him out. So the way it works, when you're mining spice, everybody knows sooner or later this worm's going to come by. So they have these spacecraft ready to rescue the miners, but it doesn't come. So Leto saves the people, and the person that's there to kind of oversee the transition from the Emperor's side is a guy named Dr. Kynes. Spoiler alert, he's very well known by the Fremen and is actually working with the Fremen to kind of fix the ecology of the world. But he's told by the Emperor to betray Leto and to just watch. Don't do anything to give Leto any clues about what's going on and make sure he fails. But inside his head, he's looking at Leto saving all the men, and he's like, oh, wow, I like this Duke. So Jessica throws a party. At this party, Dr. Kynes and other people are talking about how they can make Arcades a livable planet for everybody, how they can fix the ecosystem. Leto has to leave. He puts Paul in charge of talking to the guests, which I guess is a foreshadow that Paul will be in charge soon. And after all this, there's a bit of a lull, and Leto, up at night, decides that he needs to go talk to Jessica because, hey, I don't want her thinking that I mistrust her. As he starts walking down the hallway towards her, he hears a commotion in the servants' quarter, goes to investigate, and is attacked by Dr. Yui, who poisons him. Well, not poisons him, gives him a sedative. And before Leto passes out, puts in a tooth with a bunch of poison in it, like gaseous poison, and tells him, hey, sorry, Duke, love you, gotta do this. When you see the Baron squeezing that tooth, everybody will die. I've saved Paul and Jessica. He gives them the clue that Paul and Jessica are saved. Jessica and Paul are kidnapped to be taken to the desert to be thrown off and eaten by a worm. Leto's taken to the Baron. He does what he he was told by Yui to do, who's actually killed by Piter, and I want to get back to this because remember when we talked about Yui and how I kind of don't hate him that much?
Yeah.
But Yui is killed by Piter. Piter is killed by Leto when he presses on that tooth that has the gas in it. The Baron is able to escape, and somebody from the Emperor's house comes to check on Leto and the Baron seems to be caught in what he perceives as either a trap or a rock in a hard place or a bad place to be. And then we cut back to Paul and Jessica, and Paul has skipped like 3 levels of the Bene Gesserit. Something happens to him in this ordeal which gives him more power and actually puts him ahead of Jessica, which kind of scares Jessica. And we are left with this little tidbit is it's revealed that Jessica is the daughter of the Baron because the Baron is a rapey, crazy person. So we don't know how she's the daughter because I don't think she even knew she was his daughter. But given the background of the Baron's proclivities, it probably wasn't consensual.
Give us the because I think this is an interesting note. Give us the details on how we find that out again.
Well, Paul, when they escape the Harkonnen, which they do using their Bene Gesserit powers, he sees himself in the future confronting the Baron and calling him grandfather, and that gives him clues him into the fact that the Baron is actually Jessica's father.
That sounds familiar. Yeah, a bit of a turn, but one of these things that we see with this turn is that it was also foreshadowed a little bit, and it's like a line here or there in some of the earlier chapters where it just kind of alludes to it. And I think that Frank Herbert is actually really great at foreshadowing, which is something that I didn't necessarily plan to bring up this episode, but I think we see it everywhere, even in giving the characters these premonitions. Now, granted, this is third-party omniscient, so we get to see every character and every perspective and every thought that they're having, which is nice. But yeah, Frank Herbert does this great job of giving foreshadowing, but not too much. And on your first time reading this, you're not sure what is to be trusted and what isn't. Now, overall, the narration can be trusted for the most part. But yeah, foreshadowing. Big fan of it because it's done correctly. Now, I guess I want to pause because to validate the warranted belief that I have saying that it's done correctly. You've all seen, and I think I complained about this in which book was I complaining about the exposition where they tell me everything up front? It was recent.
Oh, I think it was in Unsold. We're talking about anime exposition and how anime does exposition sometimes in an annoying fashion.
Maybe it was just anime. Yeah, but Unsold did it well, where it still required a character who was ignorant of what was going on or didn't know about things, which is really how you do it, right? Because otherwise it's, hey, Slava, do you remember when we learned 2 + 2? And then you call me an idiot, and then I go, no, you must have forgotten. 2 + 2 is 5 on Arrakis, and da-da-da-da, whatever.
Yeah. Remember in Arrakis, it's the spice. The spice makes it 4. And you know what spice is all about, right? You're addicted to the spice. And then after you visit Arrakis, you can never leave.
Yeah. Especially if you see a Chris knife. So, it's that type of exposition and that type of foreshadowing that is done poorly. But when it's done well, you give the characters these premonitions. You give minor chats between folks of like, well, what if Jessica was a threat or to be suspicious of, or maybe she is related to someone, where the line was something like Bene Gesserit women aren't given the knowledge of who their parents are. And it's because sometimes they would do things like give uncles to sisters or whatever, the like too close family relation to further breed the power that is the Bene Gesserit lineage. So all that to say, the foreshadowing is good. Frank Herbert is good. What about you, Slava? How do you feel about the foreshadowing Are you a fan? You don't like foreshadowing? You want everything to be a surprise?
No, I'm not a big fan of surprises. I like them when they're done well, right? When something comes out of nowhere and you're like, oh, wow, that's an awesome twist. Just like Jessica being revealed to be the Baron's daughter. I think I agree with you. Well, I don't think I know. I do agree with you. Foreshadowing's done well by Herbert. There's some even what I would call reverse foreshadowing in the epigraphs, and then actual foreshadowing in the inner dialogue of Leto and Paul's premonitions. They all kind of lead the reader to eventually what was going to happen on Arrakis and Paul's, what did they call it? His horrible faith? Not faith, fate. His horrible fate.
Terrible purpose.
Terrible purpose. There it is. Terrible purpose. So, yeah, I like it. I think Herbert does it really well. And this section specifically, whether there was foreshadows or no foreshadows, this section really kept me engaged. It was so full of stuff. So much going on.
Let's unpack that a little bit. So we both know in our, what is this? This is episode 32. We know that we have different proclivities in what we really enjoy about literature. So give us a little behind the scenes Slava mental journey, a little, what was that show where the kids take Magic School Bus. Give us a Magic School Bus ride into Slava's mind. It doesn't have to be a play-by-play, but what was it that kept you engaged? Is it the questions? Is it the characters? Is it the world, the story? Like, run us through the Magic School Bus ride here.
I really liked Leto's inner dialogue, and I really liked how Jessica handled Hawat's suspicion of her when Idaho drunkenly reveals that they suspect her as a spy because of that note. I like the way she handled herself and how she handled him. And in those moments where Leto is talking to Paul or talking to Hawat and having his internal dialogues and, looking out kind of on the land and maybe even suspecting his death, and even Yui's internal dialogue and Dr. Kynes, who you later realize is helping the Fremen or working with the Fremen, loves the Duke, likes the Duke at least, right? And has to just watch him fail and watch him die. Then you have Jessica, who's, having her own existential crises later, which we talked about at the end of the recap, with her son excelling beyond her. And is he the Messiah? I forget the actual word for it. And what's going to happen to them? Yeah. What's going to happen to them? And then Paul, realizing, holy crap, I can't mourn for my father until I get some shit in order. And for a 15-year-old to have to realize that, right? And there's two things that really stood out to me in this section. Like in the chapter 14, the epigraph from Princess Urlan suggests that there's no more terrible moment of enlightenment than when a person finds out their father is a man with human flesh.
Such a good line.
And in the same vein, where Jessica looks at Paul's eyes and she realizes that these are the eyes of someone who has left innocence behind. He's no longer a child. The way it's described is his eyes are the eyes of a child who's seen death and destruction. So I think all that pulled together in this section, it's very heavy. Because in the first section, they're coming on the planet, there's foreshadowing, there's people trying to kill Paul, there's intrigue and mystery, and it does also play like a movie. You mentioned that before we started recording. All that is great. Here, dude, it's thick. Every sentence, every little section, every chapter has something interesting. It's not just, this is Leto around the conference table as generals and we get some exposition. But this section was very full, right? There's a lot going on.
Your comment on being thick with fog, quick side quest here. This whole week with the state that I live in, we're close to Canada. There have been wildfire smoke and the air quality has been absolutely horrendous. It's been difficult to breathe, and I spent $700 or $800 on multiple air purifiers that arrived the day after the smoke kind of dissipated, but could not breathe this week. You said thick with thick, and I was like,
thick with Canadian smoke.
Thick with Canadian wildfire smoke. Ugh.
Well, it's come to you. a couple of weeks ago, it was in my state, and I went outside. So the office, we have a little courtyard where we can go outside. And I went outside and I sat in Smoker's Alley, as it's called. So there's that sort of the benches are, but it's also where like a little hub is for if you want to go have a smoke. I'm never bothered by cigarette smoke in the slightest. So I'm just sitting there. And then I'm like thinking, what is going on? Is the cigarette smoke bothering me? I'm having a hard time like breathing. I'm like, oh, no. There's literally a smoke column of the Exodus proportion right in the middle of our courtyard. Are the Egyptians behind it? Like, what is going on? Because like it was thick. Then I'm like, right, yeah. The news this morning, I forgot Canada's on fire.
It's fascinating how much we don't think about air quality over here in the West, because our air quality was this week, it was like 260 or something, which is like pretty bad. But I didn't think anything of it. I was like, oh, it'll pass in a day or two, whatever. And then I had just like some weird, not quite a headache, but just like, I couldn't tell if it was like a mental thing where I'm like, oh, well, because the air quality, I'm thinking that I'm not sitting very well. Because a lot of what took place was it felt like a strong allergy week, because I do have allergies. Mm-hmm. And so I was like, just like trouble breathing. Yeah, just the wildest thing. And I was like, this is what poor air, and like other countries, like China, like the air quality, not great in all the places. And just thinking about, this is abnormal because we're so used to really, really reasonable air quality that's only usually tainted by pollen and like the changing of the seasons. But it was just fascinating. Anyway, back to your side quest over. You caused flashbacks from your one comment. I was going to talk about another question that I was sparked with, because I don't remember, and it could just be that I have a lot going on in life right now. Why does Baron Harkonnen want to take Duke Leto down? Do we know that yet? Because I don't remember that coming up. We know that he wants to. We know that he's active in it, but I can't remember that question specifically being answered.
Because it's not, and I don't think it's Baron.
All right, okay.
It all goes back to the Emperor. The Emperor wants to take Leto out.
Right.
And I'm going to assume the Emperor wants to take Leto out because Leto is, out of all the small houses, he's the most powerful. And out of all the houses, he's the most influential and loved. Because despite having flaws, and this is why it's good writing, despite having some flaws, he's a noble man. He there's even notes I read this week that there's connections to a Greek mythology here too, with Leto specifically and Paul, them being like heroes set up for a terrible fate.
Wait. Go down that side quest. I didn't know that.
All right, let me
tell me and the viewers. Yeah. That's interesting.
Notes, but let me finish this, and then I'll bring up my notes. Sure. The Emperor wants Leto out for the reasons I just said, right? And the Baron is a key player in it, and he does have some animosity towards Leto. So that's what's going on. Because remember, when Leto's dead and Baron escapes, Emperor sends one of his men to check on what the hell's going on, and Baron's kind of like, crap, they're going to know that I effed up with Leto, because everybody's in there is dead. Peter is dead, who's supposed to be the new duke. He was supposed to get the duchy, and that's evidence that it all comes from the Emperor. And why he wants Leto out, I think, for what I said, powerful, loved, small house, unmarried, has the potential to make allegiances with other houses that might be not so friendly to the Emperor's agenda. At least that's my assessment of it. Now, on to the Greek stuff.
I'm curious, sometimes in really high-end music or like orchestral music, if you're listening to it with headphones on, you can actually hear the page flips of like musicians. Uh-huh. So just a quick side quest while you're flipping through your pages to any of the listeners. I want to know if you could hear Slava flipping through the pages if you're listening to this on headphones or whatever. Just like, can you hear it? Is our audio equipment so good that you can go and you hear the flipping of the pages? Anyway, carry on.
Yeah. So Paul and Duke Leto's house name, Atreides, harkens back to ancient Greek mythology. The name Atreides is a form of the name Atreus, which recalls the ancient house of Atreus from classical Greece. Later novels in Dune series explore the connection between Atreides and their ancient forebears in great detail, making clear that Paul and Leto are indeed descended from the house of Atreus, Greek mythology. The house of Atreus includes the great heroes such as Agamemnon and Menelaus, great warriors from Homer's Iliad and other Greek myths. The backdrop of these great heroes suggests that Leto and Paul have heroic and larger-than-life fates ahead of them. But the House of Atreus legacy also includes great tragedy. The gods crushed Tantalus, the first member of the House of Atreides, to eternal temptation and damnation. Agamemnon was murdered by his wife and her lover. Duke Leto's tragic fate continues the House of Atreus' cursed legacy. Leto is a noble figure, but seems to be aware that he will suffer a tragic end on Dune. Like in other Greek myths, Leto struggles against his fate, but is unable to overcome it. Paul becomes the warrior prophet of the Fremen and leads them to ultimate victory over their enemies. Spoiler alert. But he knows there will be a tragic consequence because of his success, including the violent religious war that will spread throughout the Imperium. So that's the Greek connection. A literal one, like in the sense, in that world where Herbert connected them to actual Greek characters in Greek mythology, and kind of the themes that Herbert found in Greek mythology. He fleshed them out in Dune and the rest of the books. Yeah.
Interesting. I do like when authors, and I think I like it because I've done this, is they say nothing's new under the sun. And I've gone back to look for inspiration. We talked about this briefly with Lewis, too, where he was fascinated by space. And so he took themes of Greek gods and things and took those themes and applied it to his books. And the example that I used before was Prince Caspian was Mars. So it's a nice jumping off point to go back to something that almost primitive seems insulting, but it's early humanity that agreed upon the narratives that we were going to share. And they, I think, Tolkien as a philologist would say that they developed, which I would agree with. But there are these key stories that have become canon throughout the ages between Rome and Greek mythology primarily, and we're from the West, so that's primarily what we're littered with. But I read this book once about African mythos, and Japanese, and there's so many other mythoses in the world that we never get taught in school that are absolutely fascinating, that hold some of the same key themes. And you mentioned Agamemnon, and honestly, I think it'd be fun, this is just kind of a verbal note for us, to go through one of these, a couple of these ancient texts with like the Iliad and Homer, because they're sort of where a lot of people, tons of authors, be that consciously or subconsciously, have taken inspiration for parts of their books. So that's my little commentary on that.
No, that's good commentary. And you're right. There's nothing new under the sun, and that's why there's a shared human experience, right? You could be an ancient African or a modern American or a Chinese person from the first dynasty. Very, very different worldviews. Probably won't understand each other. And, if they're all put in a room and given a common language somehow to speak, probably wouldn't understand each other, right away. But there'll still be commonalities in the human experience. Transcends times, cultures, all that stuff. And I think Greek mythology is proof of that. Although, of course, somebody can come back and say, well, it survived and we have kind of taken it into our culture and perpetuated those stories or rewrote those stories. Fine, I'll grant that, whatever. Doesn't take away from what I'm trying to say as the meta kind of experience. I've taken a class, and this was a long time ago, in community college that was on Chinese history. And we read Chinese stories and Chinese novels, and then a novel by an American, Chinese American, writing about a family. It's, in China during and before, during, and after the revolution. And I wasn't lost, right? It's not like I couldn't relate to anything. They were foreign to me in some sense, let me put it this way, because they were talking about Chinese people in China before my dad was even alive, right? There's no reference point for me. But there were still stories about humans struggling to find love, to whether the filial piety thing that was prevalent in, and still is in Chinese culture, where how do I honor my father and mother and bring honor to my family, but I also love the guy that nobody wants me to marry. That was one of the subplots in the book. I connected with that. I understood. Like, I could read that and enjoy it. So I think, to end my rant on this, what you were talking about, that's just proof of the collective human experience, what we share as a human race. But yes, African mythos, Greek mythos, we should incorporate that into what we do and talk about in this on this quest of ours.
I know that we do short stories here and there, but I can point you toward the book that I picked up of Mythologies of the World, and we could do some of those bonus episodes we've talked about where we pick a culture and just go through 2 or 3, because they're like Aesop's fables. And speaking of which, we should read Aesop's fables here and there, or the Grimm fairy tales as well.
Mm-hmm.
Love a good fairy tale thing.
Yep.
As an introduction to that, though, I think, and we're just kind of, sorry, we'll get back. Slav, after this, can you bring us back to the book after my comment?
Yes.
I think Tolkien wrote not a narrative. Wow, it's a day. Tolkien wrote an essay on fairy stories that I think would be interesting to discuss going through these, and I think it would add to that. And we should add that to the mix. Finished. Okay, bring me back. Pull me in.
All right. Do you like the ocean?
The ocean's terrifying.
Yep. Funny you should say that. So one of the themes in the book is people and nature, right? Ecology. Ecology, if you remember from the first episode for Dune, is the study of how animals, plants, and people interact within a system, and that system could be my backyard or planet Earth. So, because of Frank Herbert's ecology background and how he wove that into this story, this chapter, at least to me, seems to highlight that, right? How the relationship between the people and the systems, the nature systems, let's call them, of Dune. The sandworms, is destructive, right? It has this awesome power. It arrives, definitely affects how we behave. Well, how the humans on Dune behave, right? The entire spice mining operation is even built to anticipate these things. So you know that these things are coming. As soon as you start making noise and that spice gathering contraption starts sucking and the engine starts going, it starts sucking the sand and sifting the spice, the thing is coming. And on the other hand, on the more positive end of this, we have the sandworms as a central figure of the Fremen religion, right? And that's kind of demonstrated by some of the Dr. Kyan's remarks as he observes Paul putting on a suit just like a Fremen would, which is the right way. And then some of the stuff he says, Paul, and the way he says it brings Kyans back to, some prophecies that the Fremen has. That he recalls prophecies. He's like, oh my gosh, is this the guy? Right? So my connection to the ocean question is that's how humans, I think, view the ocean, right? It's an awesome, crazy, scary place. And if we go to explore it, we definitely have to be aware of, more than just the great whites or a giant squid. Because you go too far down, and, as we witnessed in the news, and not in the news when you're when you're listening to this, but recently, as we're recording, 5 men went down in a tin can to see the Titanic and imploded because they didn't anticipate the safety measures or include the safe. Forget the anticipate. They didn't do all the right things. Anyway, doesn't matter. That's a rant for another podcast. So they died. So like the world, the ocean is a world unto itself, right? And when I was reading this, I'm like, there's this great unknown of the Dune planet, right? Like the same way if you find yourself just a couple of miles from coast, and it gets a little choppy, and you're looking, and the horizon's it's just nothing there, right? So you're standing on Arrakis, the Dune planet, and all you see for miles is sand and spice, right? So in my brain, that's the connections that were made. Specifically, like how humans have to interact with something vast and unknown. That's why the ocean analogy came to me. You live with it, you live next to it, you get sustenance from it. Some people worship it. It's part of, religion and religious expressions for some cultures, and yet it's vastly unknown. Just like for the people there. The Fremen might know something about it, but they haven't been able to conquer it. We haven't conquered the ocean.
So it's interesting that you talk about vastness, because I had a meeting this week with a friend of mine, and she's a UX, UI professor at a college here. And she is on the tenure track, and she is doing a piece on, she's doing a research piece on awe, and how awe, I'm going to screw this up. Sorry, Lindsay. How awe affects damn it. I literally had a 3-hour conversation with her about this. It's a meeting we've been trying to have for a while, because I find doing research personally would be a really interesting way to get money in the world, because it's like you're getting paid to learn, collect data, and then analyze it and assert your result. But she is looking at how UX, UI designers need to have a level of empathy to better create and do their job, their career, for the users. But empathy has been dropping because of technology. I'm super summarizing here. And how if you can provoke and cause people to find awe, that the fear and wonder and reverential respect that's tied together with a moment of awe could change people toward being more empathetic to the user. I'm absolutely slaughtering this, but we spoke about awe, and part of awe is to have this moment of vastness that you're talking about. And this is going to get into something that this isn't going to get into. This is one of the points I wanted to make is you don't understand vastness until you literally, I'm not just saying that, find yourself in a space where if something goes wrong, you're actually on your own. Whether that's a trip to space, whether that's a trip under the water, whether that's a trip on the water in the ocean where you're on a boat and it's if the engine dies, that's it. I'm out here. There's no coming back. Does it mean that you wouldn't get rescued because there's Coast Guards and stuff? No, it doesn't mean you wouldn't get rescued, but there's a feeling when you feel vastness. The same feeling happens when you go to a different culture. When I went to India, it's there's no safety net. It's the vastness, I think, is a feeling that you can have when you realize that there's no safety net. And people might be going, well, why does it matter if you go to a different culture and there's no safety net? It's I don't know the customs. I remember a story from years ago where a kid was in Singapore and he spit on the ground and they put him in prison, right? Other countries are allowed to run their countries however they want. If I don't know the culture and I don't know the rules, that doesn't matter. Their rules still exist. And we could go down a tangent of this. We won't, but I don't have to agree with the rules. I don't have to like the rules, but the way that the natural law works is the way that the natural law works. Same thing with the spiritual law. Spiritual law exists regardless of whether or not I A, believe in it, or B, adhere to it and submit to it. It exists. It doesn't care about my feelings. It doesn't care about any of that. There are laws of the world that exist that are irrespective. No, they just don't care about your feelings. They will be administered to your life regardless of whether or not you want them to. That said,
Yep.
this is why if you go to a different culture where it's culture shock, you experience this vastness of there's no safety net here. If I accidentally break a law, I don't know how to get in touch with the U.S. consulate. I don't know how to get out of this mess. And it's this vastness of, you're describing being in the middle of sand. No technology, no weapons, you're just out there. And you better hope that there's some sort of being watching over you to help bring you back into the fold of society of some kind, to pull you back from the vastness back down to a grounded state of being.
That's a pretty good segue into the next thing I want to talk about. And it's the epigraph from chapter 19. There's a quote from it that says, "People need hard times and oppression to develop psychic muscles." And that's something that you've talked
I remember hearing
numerous
that
times. Numerous
Go
times
into
in this episode about suffering, right? So it seems to suggest that suffering...
Are you going to tell people that I'm like Paul? I'm a Bene Gesserit man? I thought that was our secret.
I was going to say you're like Jessica, but I'll give you Paul. I don't mean to emasculate you on the podcast. No, I'm kidding.
There's nothing wrong with being a woman. Woman.
There's nothing wrong with being a woman.
Good. I
Like
don't know
every
the
single-
words in English. Oh my God.
Every single book you've given me to read that was solely your suggestion, Slava, I think you'd like this. I've liked the female characters vastly more than any of the male characters. So nothing wrong with being Princess Jessica.
Not a princess.
What was I going with?
Carry on.
Pain and suffering. All
Becoming
all the
psychic.
stuff. Becoming psychic. Yeah, in this context, it's having the powers of the Bene Gesserit, right? Which is in some form psychic powers. And like one particular form, it's literally psychic powers. But, the suggestion is that pain and suffering is what makes a person's mind stronger, and it prepares him or her to face adversity better. And this is something you've said numerous times, and I agree. But here it's literally pulled out of the book for you, so maybe you can talk about it. I'm going to quote some notes here, and maybe that will get you going. So the suggestion proves accurate during Paul's and Jessica's captivity in the Thopter. Okay.
Yeah.
Faced with extreme danger, Paul rises to the occasion using the voice to greater degree than he has previously had to trick the guards. So the idea here is everything that Paul was trained to do and everything that Paul has experienced, even though it was just a short bit of time, I think the training helped, but the actual being in this horrible situation, knowing that his father's dead, almost, realizing that these guys might rape my mother in front of me, and getting the things inside of him, his mind, his soul, whatever, getting them to do what he needs to do, right? Talk about that a little bit.
Well, as someone so suffering is I think I'm having an epiphany. I think suffering is something I'm passionate about. Question mark. I'm just gonna I'm gonna run with this. I'm sure you guys have experienced this before, where you're about to say something and then you go, "Do I really?" And maybe this is just me, but do I really believe the statement I'm about to say? And I think I do. I think that I am passionate about suffering because I think it's a part of the natural law. I think it's partly because entropy, right? I think that I've talked about this briefly before, but the state of the world is in a state of entropy, and entropy. Yeah, we had a. What book were we discussing where we were talking about entropy?
Blade Runner.
Was it Blade Runner?
Do Android?
Yeah, because the kibble.
Android dream of electric sheep? Yep.
Yeah. So, just a reminder, in case you haven't listened to that episode, entropy is the decline into disorder. It's the breaking down from order to disorder. I was much more colloquial and articulate when I said it last time, but it's the idea that everything is constantly in a state of decline, like the kibble, where your body, after the age of 25, I think, there's a point where your body's no longer the refreshing that your cells are going through is being overtaken by the decline at which your cells are going through, which is why we don't live forever. So your physical body is always in decline for the most part. Your natural state of your world is regularly in decline because there's so many outside variables coming at you here and there, from your relationships to your job to your living situation to whatever. Even if you're a billionaire, like, the world is in such a state of entropy where everything is degrading. Relationships, and that's material and immaterial. And that's your mind too, which is why they say that you should refresh your mind with wisdom and knowledge and continuing to be sharp, which, and this is just a little quip from me, but which is why hedonism and nihilism are actually deeply detrimental to you as a being, physical and spiritual and moral, because you're just choosing to embrace that which is entropy. So back to my point, I think that I'm passionate about suffering because it's a guarantee. There are a few things in life that are guaranteed. Suffering is one of them. There's an old saying, like, all that you have in life is death and taxes. I'm paraphrasing and I'm not doing it justice, but those are the two guarantees in life, death and taxes. Well, I'm adding one, it's suffering. So I'm passionate about suffering because it's something that we all have to go through, whether or not we want to. Your 2-year-old suffers, your 90-year-old suffers that you know in your life. And I'm passionate about it because everyone has to go through their version of hell, and the degrees change. But when we embrace the fact that suffering is coming for us, that it's here, and that there's new suffering around the corner, we have options. And some of those options are, we can start preparing for the next level of suffering. And one of the ways that you do that, and these are people that we find inspirational, is choosing to do hard things when we don't have to. Running a mile, doing a marathon, lifting weights, forcing yourself to be educated so you get a promotion, choosing to serve at the local soup shop, embracing the fact that there are homeless people in front of you who can't afford food. And what do you do with that? How do you engage with the suffering before you when it's not your suffering? Things like that. So, yeah, I think I am passionate about suffering, and it's just interesting to, like, be experiencing an epiphany and having to talk about it at the same time, because it's not necessarily fully articulate. But I think that it is the embrace of suffering, and I'm going to quote Viktor Frankl again, like I do. It's that we get to choose, and this is one of the beautiful things about being human. It's also one of the most terrible things, because it's such it is a divine level of power to be able to define suffering in our lives. I'm going to say that a second time. It is a divine level of power. It makes you a god in some sense, that you get the opportunity to define the suffering in your life and what it's going to do for you. I'm going to say it a third time. Like, I don't think that people understand. You get to define, you get to embrace, by having free will in your life, regardless of what's going on, you get to choose what suffering means to you. That's huge. Like, I realize that I've deviated from Paul here, but I'm sure that you can bring us back here in a second.
What you just said, what you repeated 3 times, the beauty of it is, as you suffer and as you face hardships, it only strengthens that muscle, right? For these people, it's the psychic Bene Gesserit muscle. Right. But it's also other stuff. Like, that's not solely the point that Herbert is making by putting these words in Urilan's mouth. As you suffer and as you face adversity and you do it correctly, and you're not going to do it correctly all the time, but as you do it correctly, like you have quoted Frankl, the next time you face adversity, you are better prepared. You are able to work through it in a much more mature way. And the next time something else comes along that is also suffering or hardships that's greater or different or bigger than what you just went through, you are still better prepared for it. I lift weights every morning, and I do cardio every morning. I've been doing it for about 5 months, and I've lost 4 inches from my belly.
That's awesome.
And I put on more muscle mass. And I started with a 50-pound kettlebell, and everything that I do with it has gotten easier every day. So the same thing with suffering. If you do it well, and you're able to face it daily and train your mind and your heart to face it with maturity. After a while, yeah, this sucks. This is suffering. This is horrible. And we can list a litany of hypotheticals, but you're able to face it well. And one thing I'm going to throw in here, and then I'll let you land this plane, is I was watching, I think, Billy Bob Thornton, and he said, I'm in a constant melancholy because of my brother's death. And I am okay with that because my brother deserves the sadness that I feel daily because first of all, he was my brother, but we were very, very close brothers. And he deserves the pain that I live with every day because just to go like, okay, I'm over it, doesn't give him the deference that he deserves as my brother. So I'm sad every day because I don't have my brother. But how I live with that sadness and how I choose to define it, to use Frankel's words, how I choose to define it and how I choose to live with it is what gives me the power to go on. I think hard times, to quote Princess Irulan, hard times and oppression develop muscles. I'll leave out the psychic part because we're not psychic, but it develops mental muscles. It develops emotional muscles, intellectual muscles. And so it's a very diverse kind of speaking of the ocean, right? All this stuff is so diverse and there's so many moving parts at once for this thing that we call the human experience. But at its core, it's how you deal with these things that, either you survive or you lose yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I know we got to wrap up here. You asked me to land the plane. I think that the state of society has taught us that it's okay to not hustle, it's okay to be comfortable, it's okay to whatever. And I think that is a blatant lie because suffering is coming for you. It's going to look different than what it looks like for Slava. It's going to look different than what it looks like for me, but suffering is coming for you. And if you want an easier life, and I use the word easier because life is hard in general, but if you want an easier life, then you have to choose to do hard things before suffering comes for you, because then you're able to weather the storm of suffering easier.
Yeah.
But the suffering's not easy in general, but you can make it a little easier by embracing suffering before you have to, and working out's just the easy example, by forcing yourself to do really hard things. And when you think when you think you have to quit, you keep pushing regardless. That's the first part. The second part to land this plane is you have to start journaling out your suffering and putting meaning to it and go, I really appreciated the time with my brother, like the example that you gave. And how I'm going to deal with it is I'm going to live with this, constant state of melancholy because he's worth it. And it doesn't mean that every day goes well, but it does mean you need reminders, which is why I don't mind harping on this over and over and over again. Truth is not something that you just memorize once and then you're good to go. It's a constant refresher that needs to happen. So I have talked about this a dozen times so far, and I will talk about it a dozen more until I also pass into the void.
Yeah, that's actually very poignant. Truth needs constant reminder. It needs to be constantly in your head.
We're not hard drives. We don't get to just like, oh, hey, I got to go reference this file.
Right. In seminary, the way you're taught not to make the Bible a textbook is outside of seminary. You should be able to read the Bible in a more worshipful way. And when you get in the seminary class, that's when it becomes a textbook, and you dissect it, mechanically and more detached. By that I mean, in life, there is certain things that are just mechanical, and you have to do them because you have to do them, like wipe your butt and eat in the morning and get enough sleep and drink water and hygiene and all that other stuff. And then there's stuff that you need to do that is more, call it worshipful, more spiritual things, where you have to feed the brain and the heart in a way that exercises a different muscle, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if we're going to continue with that. And the second thing is humans are just fickle, and we constantly need a reminder of truth.
And that's the truth. As always, we're glad that you joined us today. tune in next time for Dune Part 3. Also, as I read sometime in the past episode, love the hate, love the comments. So let me know where I'm wrong. Let me know that I'm not funny. Let me know. Just engage. Just let me know. Let Slava know that he's funnier than I am. Let us bicker it out. Whatever. What books do you want us to read? So like, comment, subscribe, share with a friend. Even if you tell your friend, because I'll do this sometimes, is, hey, listen to the last 10 minutes of this episode. You don't need to listen to the whole thing. Most of it's garbage. But the end, like, it reminds me of something that we talked about last week, blah, blah, blah. So, anyway, thanks for tuning in for Dune Part 2, and we will see you on the next one.
Goodbye, good people.